That's that. Good evening, everybody, and thank you for attending this evening's webinar, Operation Colour Scheme. This presentation is being recorded and placed into our company's, and will be placed into our company's archives along with our other presentations. This evening's presentation will be given by Past Master Bruce Hode, who will shed some light on the top secret arrangements that were put in place for the National Fire Service to protect the Overlord invasion infrastructure and assets prior to, during and beyond D-Day. Bruce's chosen charity this evening is the Worshipful Company of Firefighters Charitable Trust in support of the good works they undertake. Should you wish to donate to this worthy cause, a link will be sent out in the near the end of this presentation that you can follow. Should you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A button, which is located at the bottom of your screen. And these will be put in to Bruce at the end of the presentation. But for now, without further ado, I will now hand you over to Bruce. Over to you, Bruce.
Thank you, Colin. And good evening, everybody. I'd like to extend a particular welcome to the non-company members who have joined us this evening for the webinar. Most of whom are from across the Great Divide in Kent. To all of you, if it's your first time attending any form of event with the company, hopefully it might not be your last, and perhaps we can talk about that at another time. Yes, as Colin rightly said, what I'm going to be talking about this evening is Operation Colour Scheme, which was carried out by the National Fire Service to provide protection to the D-Day preparations across southeast England, all of the areas involved in D-Day preparation. But this evening, we're going to be focusing on one area in particular, which was the Fire Force area that covered Sussex. But before we do that, I just want to give you a little bit of background to the National Fire Service and what was going on at that time in the NFS. Okay, the NFS was created in August 1941, largely in response to the experience gained during the Blitz of late 1940 and through to mid-1941. And it was made up of an amalgamation of the Auxiliary Fire Service, which had been formed in 1938, and the approximately 1,600 local authority fire brigades that were dotted about all over the country at that time. And it was created for a variety of reasons, but foremost amongst those were the need to standardise equipment and training across the fire service, to provide an ability to deploy large amounts of resource to any location that was under pressure from enemy attack, for example, London or Coventry. And when the NFS was formed, England and Wales were split into 12 regions. Each region was subdivided into a more manageable sized fire force area, which were in the main slightly larger than a typical fire brigade that we might recognise today. And Fire Force 31 in Region 12, which is the area hatched down in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Fire Force 31 covered all of the old boundaries of East Sussex, some of Kent, and some of Surrey, and little bits of what we now know as West Sussex. It was commanded by Charles Birch, OBE. He was the Fire Force commander. And prior to the war, he had been the Chief Fire Officer of Brighton Fire Brigade from 1929 through to 1941. He served as the NFS Fire Force commander from 41 through till 1948, when the NFS was disbanded and the fire service was returned to local control. And after that, he continued to serve as the Chief Fire Officer for Brighton from 48 through to 1954. We're extremely fortunate that his records of Operation Colour Scheme survived and were made available some years ago by his family to the fire service locally, and that's how it came into our hands. Along with Chief Officer Birch's records, there was also a volume that had been maintained by his staff officer, who was a column officer on the left of this picture, Mr. Sprent, and more of Mr. Sprent later. So as I say, these two very important historical documents survived, and we're very fortunate to be able to take the pick of them this evening. Now, prior to D-Day, there was a large British and Canadian military exercise carried out in between August and September 1943 to test the arrangements for the embarkation of a large cross-channel invasion force. And this was known as Exercise Harlequin. And it was mainly concentrated in NFS Region 12 and to a large extent in Fire Force Area 31. And it was carried out under very realistic conditions. And it was the first large military exercise that the NFS had been involved in. Additional personnel, fire service personnel, resources and appliances moved into the Fire Force area, and precautions were put in place to meet the anticipated enemy response that actually never really came. And this picture shows Colonel Inglis at South East Command Headquarters at Aldershot talking to one of the fire service liaison officers. Now, drawing on the lessons that have been learnt in Exercise Harlequin, detailed plans were drawn up which allowed the Fire Force commander to give an accurate estimate of the reinforcements he was going to need to augment his existing levels of fire cover, to cover the expected response of the Luftwaffe in its attempt to disrupt the pre-invasion build-up in the Fire Force area of responsibility. And this picture shows a meeting between Army and fire officers at the District Army headquarters in Lindfield, which is now in West Sussex. Right, as a result of that, Mr. Birch requested an additional 893 firemen and 539 firewomen, of which he received 1,038 firemen and 265 firewomen. Excuse me. He requested 259 additional fire appliances of all types, and he received 182. The areas shown on the map in different colours indicate areas and also give the name colour scheme to the operation. The blue areas, which are principally across the south of England and then curve around London up into East Anglia, they were the areas that needed to be reinforced above their maximum strength. The green areas were the areas that were going to be reinforced up to their maximum strength, and the brown areas were areas from which personnel and equipment would be withdrawn to augment the forces in the blue and green areas. For colour scheme, the sites of strategic importance to the success of the invasion that needed to be protected included the ports, and in our area we're talking about Rye, Newhaven and Shoreham, the fuel storage and distribution points for the invasion, troop concentration areas, airfields, road convoys and the convoy routes, and more of all of those later. So from the end of January 1944 and through to May 44, reinforcements started to arrive at Brighton. And here we can see a couple of shots of reinforcing firefighters arriving at Brighton Rail Station. And as I said, the total number of transferred personnel were 1,038 firemen and 265 firewomen. When they arrived, each firefighter was interviewed to clarify the skills and experience that they brought with them, and then each was allocated a post at a fire station. And here we can see arriving firefighters having their ID cards checked and collecting their ration books. But when they arrived, they had to be housed, they had to be fed, paid, there had to be welfare arrangements put in place for them, and very importantly, they had to be familiarised with the areas in which they were going to be working. Now we can see some of the appliances are arriving for colour scheme. This shot we believe to have been taken in Fairways in Dyke Road in Brighton, which was a reinforcing base for the scheme. There's a convoy of appliances arriving, part of the 182 additional vehicles. And here you can see a line of Austin auxiliary towing vehicles, ATVs, with their trailer pumps. Other appliances arriving as reinforcement included dam units, escape carriers, heavy pumping units, etc. And here you can see a column of specialist vehicles lining up on arrival. For the personnel who were coming into the scheme, security was paramount. And so one of the first things that they would do would be to be subjected to a series of security briefings. And here we can see arriving personnel going for their first security brief in the Astoria Cinema in Brighton. And a number of us will be familiar with the next building. Here's a further security briefing being carried out by an Army intelligence officer at Preston Circus Fire Station in Brighton. Now, just like the troops who were going to be taking part in D-Day, the firefighters who joined the scheme had to be kept fit and trained. And here we can see some drill and PT being carried out at Withdean at one of their camps. Again at Withdean, this is on the tennis lawns car park. You can see the crews training with an ATV, a trailer pump and portable dams, a typical pump and hose drill. And here at Glyndebourne camp, we can see an improvised assault course and firefighters being put through their paces there. Interestingly, the women that arrived with the scheme were also trained. And again, this is at Glyndebourne. And here we can see an all-female crew exercising with a Coventry Climax light trailer pump with the same portable dam and carrying out exactly the same drill as their male counterparts. Again, at Glyndebourne, here we can see the personnel attending a lecture on bomb identification by a bomb disposal officer of the British Army. A bit of nimble footwork to get out of the way by the instructor there. Here we can see dispatch rider training taking place on Ditchling Beacon. And I'm going to talk about the role of dispatch riders in more detail a little later. Right now, when the NFS was formed in 1941, it quickly recognised that it was going to have to be largely self-sufficient in constructing and repairing the nation's firefighting infrastructure after the Blitz. And measures were taken at a very early stage to recruit personnel who had the appropriate building skills to carry out this task. So if you were a bricklayer, a chippy, a plumber, or whatever, you were far more likely to be recruited straight away into the NFS because those skills were needed in addition to your role as a firefighter. And the first drafts to arrive in Brighton included people with these additional skills to assist with the uprating and improving of the current firefighting arrangements. Here we can see a new fire station constructed at New Haven Harbour on the East Quay, and another shot of it in build. But as well as providing new fire stations and upgrading existing stations, they also had to install all the necessary support facilities, including workshops, mobilising and control centres, communication systems, firefighting, water storage and distribution networks in areas of risk. Here you can see hose drying towers and hose masts being installed at Patcham, just on the outskirts of Brighton. And also, they had to provide access roads to all of these new facilities. Here we can see a new NFS workshop being constructed at Framfield in East Sussex. I mentioned control facilities. Well, here's a new subdivisional control room being established in early 1944. In addition to this one, which was at Southwick in the Port Fire Office, or Shoreham Harbour, other control rooms were put in at Hove, Lewes, Haywards Heath, and Shoreham itself. In addition to providing the control rooms, the communications also had to be installed, and additional exchange lines and private wires were installed to link these control rooms to fire stations, to military headquarters, to the military camps in which fire service units were installed, to the pumping pipelines, to police and civil defence headquarters. And this work was carried out mainly by fire service personnel, but with the support of the GPO. And here you can see those lines actually being installed. I said I'd return to the role of dispatch rider. Now, their role was crucial in the event of a failure of wired communications. And in times of enemy air attack, that was particularly likely. And to give you an idea of how important the Fire Force commander thought that this means of communication was, he requested an additional 97 motorcycles in his reinforcement request, though he only actually received an additional 27. Here we can see, and now we're talking about water infrastructure, here we can see a borehole pump being installed by NFS personnel on Brighton Pier, and then fed by that pump. Here's the pipeline, the distribution pipeline that ran along the seafront between Brighton and Hove, with a booster pump installed midway along the line. Here we can see NFS personnel digging up a road in Hove to lay a pipeline. And again, personnel fabricating the pipeline prior to it being installed underground. But as most of us firefighters will recognise, distribution systems are prone to being knocked out, particularly in air raids. And so they have to be backed up by bulk emergency water supplies, or EWS as we knew them, which were also vital for firefighting. And here we can see a large EWS being constructed in Hove. Now, what about the risks that colour scheme was going to have to cover? Well, clearly the ports and harbours, and we're going to talk about those in more detail, but also the troop concentration areas, the storage for all logistics items, vehicles, fuel, ammunition, etc. Mustn't forget the convoy routes and the convoys, and again, we'll talk about those in more detail later. They're not fixed, but they're every bit as important as everything else. The command and control centres and operational airfields. Now, why were ports and harbours so particularly important? Well, obviously, they were the embarkation and loading points for the invasion forces, but they also invariably contained bulk storage of supplies for the invasion, bulk storage of fuel, and refueling points, and a fuel pipeline network, extensive fuel pipe works. And in order to augment the NFS's resources, a number of naval auxiliary boats were transferred from the Admiralty to the NFS, and more about those again later. Right, so we spoke about the principal ports in the Fire Force area being Rye, Newhaven and Shoreham. Well, one of the principal methods of protecting those ports was by fireboat, and consequently the following fireboats were attached to port protection. At Shoreham, we had 4 boats: the fireboat Catcher, which was capable of operating in moderate seas, the Mullion, which was fully seagoing, and 2 of the naval auxiliary boats which had been transferred from the Admiralty. At Newhaven, we had the WWII, which was a moderate seagoing vessel, the Wavecrest and the Alderman, which were principally inland water fire boats, and 2 of the NABs, we believe, which were transferred from the Admiralty. And at Rye, being an inland harbour, there were no seagoing fireboats required, so Rye was covered by 2 of the NABs, and we'll look at those in some more detail in a moment. Well, that's the Mullion. She was fully seagoing. We've got a couple of shots of her. See how quite a purposeful vessel. There's the Catcher, which was capable of operating in moderate seas, and the WWII at Newhaven Harbour, which again was a moderate seagoing vessel. Right, now the NABs, the Naval Auxiliary Boats. They started out life as landing craft, and they were termed landing craft vehicle. And these LCVs were converted by the Admiralty, and they were classed as minor landing craft. When the NFS got their hands on them, they were fitted with a Dennis fire pump, a full complement of hose, fixed suction and firefighting equipment, and they were camouflaged by the NFS. Interestingly, you can see their indication of their former life as landing craft. If you look at the front of the right-hand photograph, you can see the fixed ramp in place that in the landing craft role will have dropped down and allowed a vehicle to roll off the boat. And there we are. We can see Rye's NABs after they've been liveried up and camouflaged. You can see the Fire Force 31 markings on the side of the fireboat. As I say, Rye didn't need seagoing fireboats, being an inland harbour, hence the 2 NABs. Here's another shot of Rise, one of Rise NABs. The NFS also had a few DUKWs, or ducks, which were amphibious lorries, load carriers effectively, and they were deployed in some of the major ports, for example, Plymouth, but there's no evidence of ducks having operated in the Fire Force 31 area. Here we can see the two RAI NABs exercising. You can see the front ramp very clearly in that picture. Although we say they were smallish or light landing craft, they were still 10 to 11 ton capacity boats, so certainly more than capable. And here we can see the Dennis fire pump providing 4 very healthy firefighting jets from one of the NABs. Now, I would have to say that accommodation for the NAB crews at RAI was anything but palatial. They were actually housed in converted buses, and this was their accommodation for the duration of Operation Colour Scheme. But I suppose at least they were reasonably warm and dry. Now what I want to do is to move on to the troop concentration areas that Colour Scheme protected in Fire Force Area 31. The marshalling area camps, which are the first ones we're going to look at, were headquartered by 2 of the ports, Newhaven and Shoreham. So under Newhaven, we had the following marshalling camps at Thurl Place, Stanmer Park, Middleton Manor, Novington Manor, Hook Estate, Sutton Hall, and Buckham Hill at Eastfield. And when we say marshalling area camps, these were for the troops who were going to be going overseas. This is where they were marshalled prior to them being taken to the embarkation ports and the embarkation camps immediately before D-Day. And governed by Shoreham, we had Danny Park, Wykehurst Place at Bolney, Ford Hill at Balcombe, and Pax Hill at Ardingly. And right in the centre of the Newhaven area, we have Conyborough at Cooksbridge. Now, Conyborough was not officially a marshalling camp, but it was described as a combined stores depot and transit camp. And interestingly, this must have been a very important facility because a firefighting unit was required to remain there until October 1944, 4 months after D-Day, and that was far longer than units stayed at the other marshalling camps. And then the embarkation camps, which is where the troops moved to from the marshalling camps prior to getting onto the landing craft. Under Newhaven, these were situated at Piddinghoe and Denton, which are just outside of the town. And for Shoreham, we believe that they were housed in Buckingham House School, although we're not able to confirm that absolutely. Now, why were these camps chosen? Right, first and foremost, they had to be close to the embarkation ports. They'd previously been used in Exercise Harlequin. They were places that could be made secure. And invariably, they were either in or close to parks and woodland that allowed a large build-up of materiel to be camouflaged. And for every one of those camps that I spoke about, NFS pumps and personnel were sent to each of them, with the exception of Novington Manor, which was covered by nearby stations. For those of us from across the Great Divide in Kent, fire service units were also posted to Broadwater Forest, just outside of Tunbridge Wells, and an ammunition depot in Sevenoaks, just after D-Day. It doesn't state why NFS personnel were deployed to Broadwater Forest, although there was a large concentration of Canadians there. But there was an underground command facility built on the edge of the forest, actually in Hargate Forest, in 1943, and that command facility is still there today, albeit derelict. So each of the camps was provided with a mobile dam unit towing a large trailer pump, and here you can see the one arriving at Coneyburgh at Cooksbridge. And depending on the risk that was being protected, then additional equipment such as foam apparatus might have been supplied. And the plan was that the crew that was deployed to the camp would make the initial attack on any fire, and then they would be backed up by appliances from either the nearest local fire station or adjacent camps. Now, where possible, these pump crews were billeted within the building that was used for the headquarters of the camp commandant and his staff. And in some of the big old country houses, this was possible. But where it wasn't, then the crews were either accommodated in Nissen huts, as shown here at Sutton Hall and Barkham, or in tented accommodation, such as this here at Coneyburgh. Got a couple of shots of the accommodation that the crews were provided with. This was typical marquee accommodation. You can see across the roof that the marquee is camouflaged. These were typical army issue marquees that the NFS were occupying. And here's another shot of Cooksbridge that clearly shows the emergency water supply in the centre of the photograph that has been constructed. Now, typically a crew that was deployed to a camp would consist of one leading fireman and 6 firemen. They were part of the camp establishment, and they were fed and billeted by the military in the camp. A crew would remain on the camp at all times, and personnel were allowed off camp when they were off duty until the later stages closer to D-Day, when the crews were entirely confined to camp in common with the other troops, and no leave or absence from the camp for any reason was permitted, and obviously that was for security reasons. Now, complete surveys of the camps were carried out, and it was usually found that it was necessary to construct one or more 5,000-gallon steel dams at strategic points where the water supply was deemed inadequate. And here we can see one of those steel dams, or preparations for installing one of those steel dams in the ground. Now, the crews were also responsible for providing and maintaining first attack firefighting equipment and training. Here we can see a first attack firefighting equipment point established at Barkham. This is at Sutton Hall. And also the crews carried out extinguisher training for the military personnel. And here you can see NFS crews training military crews in basic firefighting techniques. One of the other things that they did was to train the crews, or train the troops rather, in how to deal with incendiary bombs. And here you can see incendiary bomb training again being delivered to the troops by NFS personnel. I spoke about the importance of convoy routes because clearly you had to get the troops immediately prior to D-Day from the marshalling camps to the embarkation camps and the ports. And the only way to do that was by road convoy. And the convoys were deemed particularly vulnerable to air attack. And so the military provided the NFS with 4,000 foam and water extinguishers to enable them to set up hundreds of first attack fire points, so that were a convoy to be attacked or were a fire to break out in a convoy, the military could tackle any fire prior to the arrival of the fire service. And here's a point set up on the A27 between Lewes and Beddingham. And for those of you who are familiar with this road, that junction is almost unchanged today. Here we can see another fire point set up. I'm not quite sure where that one is, but you can see the military vehicles in the picture. And this shot was taken through the front window of an army, I guess, light utility vehicle. Although the NFS did use a few light utilities, but I think this is an army one. Now, interestingly, in his memoirs, effectively, his account of colour scheme, the Fire Force commander, Mr. Burt, says that the fire service spent long hours engaged in special service calls prior to and after the invasion. Examples of this help include pumping water from damaged landing craft, towing in ammunition ships, going to sea with parts of the invasion fleet, pumping water from parts of the emergency harbour, the Mulberry Harbour, used for landing on French soil, and assisting with the training of commandos in cliff climbing. Many such calls were of an everyday occurrence. If any assistance was required by the armed forces, their first contact was the fire service because our help was always available, said Mr. Birch. I don't want to look, excuse me, I'll have a mouthful of tea. I want to have a quick look at a few examples of the work that was carried out by the NFS in support of the D-Day forces, and one or two of these might surprise you. Waterproofing of vehicles. Well, here we can see the NFS thoroughly cleaning tanks prior to them being waterproofed. But then taking that a stage further, we provided the use of the 150,000 gallon capacity static tank in Preston Park, which we loaned to the military to test the waterproofing of vehicles. Pumping water from damaged landing craft. We'll talk about this in more detail in a moment. Now I just want to move on to and briefly talk about the NFS overseas contingent, which was a key component of colour scheme. In March 1944, volunteers from the NFS were invited to join a newly formed contingent to be part of the invasion of France on D-Day. And those who volunteered went before selection boards, and everybody had to undergo very strict tests and medical examination. If they were accepted, they underwent specialised firefighting training, fitness workouts, long route marches, etc. They practiced getting pumps on and off landing craft, sometimes under fire, and 5 columns in all were formed, and they were ready for operation in time for the 6th of June, ready to cross the channel to assist the armed forces by putting out fires as troops advanced. Now, a column of the overseas contingent would consist of 60 pumps, split up, plus support vehicles, split up into a headquarters and 5 companies. A company would consist of 12 pumps plus their support vehicles, a headquarters and 2 sections, each consisting of 6 pumps and support. And 1 column was formed in each of the regions 4, 5, 6, 7, and 12. On the 25th of January 1945, number 4 column was sent into action, sailing from Tilbury to Ostend. They were sent not to assist the British Army, who were being protected by the Army Fire Service, but to assist the American Army. The column headquarters and 1 other company went to Namur, 2 companies to Liège, 1 to Verdun, and 1 to Étain. Within a few hours of arriving at Verdun, the company was in action, fighting a severe roof fire in a hotel being used by the American troops. In the main, the NFS units were with the 12th US Army Group and the Quartermaster Corps, whilst others were attached to the US Army Ordnance Corps. And their primary role was to protect fuel, ration and ammunition dumps. And it wasn't long before the whole of number 4 column was spread over Holland, France, Belgium and Luxembourg. And on the 17th of March 1945, the first NFS crews crossed over the line and into Germany. The column finally boarded ships home on the 15th of July 1945, which was actually over a month after VE Day. And during their time within that theatre of war, NFS personnel attended over 500 recorded large incidents, 120 pipeline leaks and special services, and obviously numerous smaller incidents and special services. The American forces with whom they worked thought they were the best thing since sliced bread. Interestingly, the British Army didn't want to know anything at all about them. We have the Army Fire Service, why would we want them? And maybe a little bit of that dates back to the time of the Phony War, when AFS personnel in particular were regarded as draft dodgers and malingerers. Wholly unfair, but I'm afraid that was the view of firefighters at that time. This picture was taken on the morning of the 6th of June, and it's from Mr. Sprent's volume, and it is annotated. This photo was taken from the NFS observation post on the tower of Shoreham Church. Hundreds of boats are visible by glasses passing off the coast during the invasion. This harbour was filled with hundreds of landing craft on the previous day. And you can clearly see the officer on the right of the photograph is Column Officer Sprent. So after D-Day, what did the NFS do? Here we can see a landing craft washed up on New Haven Beach after the invasion. It was pumped out by the NFS prior to being removed on the 11th of June, 5 days after D-Day. And salvage of damaged landing craft was a big part of the NFS's activity in that period. Here we can see another landing craft being pumped out, this time by one of the NABs. I think this is in Shoreham Harbour in the area known as the Basement. And here we can see another picture of the same operation. Now, because of its location in the southeast of England and on the route to London, Fire Force Area 31 was subject to a very high level of flying bomb activity. And just under 1,500 flying bombs had either fallen, been shot down, or brought down by barrage balloons in the force area. And at least 400 of these incidents required the attendance of the fire service for rescue purposes or to deal with the resulting fires. Many service buildings were damaged, the worst incident being at East Grinstead on the 12th of July 1944, where the fire station was totally demolished and all of the fire appliances seriously damaged when a flying bomb landed close to the station. Here's some pictures of the damaged appliances after that incident. On the 30th of June 1944, there was a particularly tragic incident at Crockham Hill in Kent, when a hostel for evacuated children was hit, and 21 children and 8 staff were killed, although crews did manage to rescue 10 people and prevent the fire spreading to other parts of the building where people were trapped. At that incident, a fireman was severely injured when, whilst he was involved in rescue work, he became entangled in a live high voltage wire, which burnt a hole in his cheek and burnt off one of his ears. Luckily, he was pulled free by a colleague who used his fire axe to pull him free of the cable. It's another picture of the damage to the appliances at East Grinstead. Crews were called to a haystack fire following a flying bomb incident, and whilst they were damping down and turning over, they sadly found the body of 2 people who'd been sheltering behind it when the bomb fell. It collapsed on them and had suffocated them. And crews from Wadhurst prevented a major tragedy when they found that a flying bomb had damaged the railway line, and they just managed to stop an oncoming London to Hastings train just in time to prevent a derailment. On the 18th of September at Battle Fire Station, the Home Secretary, Herbert Morrison, gave thanks to all the services who have been so fully engaged day and night as a result of flying bomb activity. And alongside Mr. Morrison, on the right of the photograph, is Fire Force Commander Mr. Birch. Now, by early 1944, the process of removing the beach defences that had been laid down in 1940 was in progress. But it was quickly realised that tidal action had moved many of the mines that had been laid in 1940 from their original positions. And so the mine maps that had been drawn up then were completely useless. And many bomb disposal personnel had already been killed or injured carrying out the beach clearances. So in April 1944, initial trials were carried out to explore the use of high pressure water jets to expose and or detonate the mines that were laid on the beaches. These trials recommenced in November 1944, once the dust had settled from D-Day, using a monitor that had been removed from a fireboat that was powered by fixed high pressure pumps, or the pumps carried on the 2 Shoreham NAVs. Fire service workshops had mounted this monitor on a mobile armoured platform, which you can see very clearly in this picture. And the experiments proved so successful that further sets were placed on order to carry out this method of mine disposal. Here we can see the process being demonstrated to a collection of British, Canadian and American officers in the background. Now, the work required a lot of water at high pressure, and here we can see the NAVs by now looking a little bit knocked about. It looks as if they've had a reasonably active war by this stage. Here we can see them providing water to the mine disposal teams. Here it's fed through a booster pump and off to the disposal platforms. And here you can see the successful detonation of a mine off in the distance. A shot of another mine being detonated, and here you can see this being observed by British and American officers. Now, from the beginning of November 1944, the drafts of reinforcements were released from colour scheme and allowed to return to their home services. And by mid-December 1944, with the exception of the overseas contingent, all personnel had been returned to their home locations, and Operation Colour Scheme was wound down. And here we can see some of the fire women who had been part of the scheme returning from whence they came. So, in summary, in Fire Force 31 area, an additional 1,300 personnel and around 180 appliances had been received. Across all of the involved areas, that's the whole of colour scheme, in those areas that were coloured blue in the initial map, around 12,000 personnel and over 1,000 appliances were moved into the colour scheme areas from other parts of the country. We spoke about security a little earlier, but so successful was the security around colour scheme that it is believed that none of the facilities were specifically targeted by the Luftwaffe from the formation of colour scheme through to and beyond D-Day. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope you found that interesting. And now I would be more than happy to field any questions. So Colin, back to you.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. I mean, the question, what did the NFS do for us? I think the answer has to be a lot more than we would ever know. I mean, the data and the details that you've just dispensed to us is unbelievable in some circumstances, and it was really impressive what they've done. Yeah, we do have a couple of people for questions. I've got one from Peter Mancy. He wants to know what a GAM unit is.
What a?
GAM, Golf Alpha Mike unit.
Got me there, I'm afraid. No, I don't know. I don't know what a GAM unit is.
Oh, okay. Right. I've also got somebody's hand up. I've got Nicole's hand up. If you do want to ask a question, then raise your hand. I think it might be a bit quicker than, and I think Nicole's just taken her hand down. So maybe she didn't have a question. I've just got a chat from Anne Isaacs saying, thank you so much, Mr. Hode. That was exceptionally interesting, which I think we all must agree with. Right, so I've got Brian Spearman, who's got his hand up. Okay, Brian, if you'd like to ask your question. You're on mute at the moment. Brian?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Brian, yeah.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. Bruce, I think I just am gobsmacked about the amount of information you've given us. And how is it that you managed to keep it so secret, bearing in mind many of the faux pas that occurred all over the country in other structures and organisations? How do you feel that actually occurred?
I think it's a combination of factors, Brian. I think you have to understand that in the early stages of the war, the fire service was not held in particularly high esteem, and it wasn't until the Blitz that people began to realise how necessary the expanded fire service was. And I think as a result of that, the fire service tended to be fairly backward in coming forward. They didn't necessarily publicise a lot of what they did. And this, of course, was extremely top secret, all of this, because if there had been any leak, any security leak around colour scheme, then it had the ability to prejudice the security of Operation Overlord, and that just couldn't be allowed to happen. Why it's never been made public since, I don't know. I guess it's just one of those things, but it's a little known but incredibly important part of the fire service's history in World War II.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Brian. Okay, next one we've got is from Andrew Morgan. So let's see if Andrew can talk. You're on mute, Andrew.
Yeah, can you hear me, Colin?
Yeah.
Bruce, I thought that was fantastic, Bruce.
Hello, Andrew.
The amount of photographs you've got is extraordinary.
I have to say there are many more,
are there?
but we had to cut it down, or we'd have been here all night.
Oh, I thought they were superb. I've actually got two questions. What was the actual role then of the Army Fire Service, given that they've really been superseded by the NFS? I guess that's point one. And the second point was a firefighter's role reserved during the war?
Right. Okay, the Army Fire Service was part of the Royal Army Service Corps. It was an integral part of the Army. And prior to, during and after the war, the Army Fire Service's role was to do for the Army pretty much exactly what we've described the NFS doing in colour scheme for the invasion forces. They looked after the camps, looked after all kinds of Army facilities, and they were a fully trained and equipped fire service in their own right. And clearly they did a very, very good job in Europe after D-Day, because the NFS wasn't called upon by the British forces. I think that was a great shame. I think there was an opportunity lost there to cement the links between forces who had both been involved incredibly heavily with the war. So that probably answers the first part of your question. Sorry, and refresh my memory. The second part of the question, Andrew.
Yeah, the second part was, being a firefighter, a reserved occupation during the war.
Ah, yes, right, okay. Right, that particular ball got knocked about a bit as we went through the war. To start with, in 1938, when it was clear that there was going to be a significant air war element to the coming conflict, there was a massive recruitment for the fire service, and the auxiliary fire service was formed, and thousands and thousands of additional firefighters were recruited up and down the country. But then they were allowed to drift away through the phony war, and a lot of them became very disenchanted. They were treated very poorly, I have to say, or many of them were treated very poorly by the service. And it wasn't until the Blitz that their true worth was really recognised. And after that, yes, they were reserved. Interestingly, I didn't mention it in the presentation, but all of the firefighters who served in colour scheme were awarded the Defence Medal. Those that went over to Europe and went through France and into Germany were awarded the France and Germany Star. And one fire service officer, and I don't know quite how he managed it, but he got himself seconded as an advisor to Allied forces in Sardinia and Italy. I think he passed through Malta and Gozo on the way, and he was awarded the Italy Star. So to some extent, their contribution was recognised.
That's great, thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Andrew. Right, we've got another one, which is a statement really from Nicole Hoffman, saying they should make a film of this, which I think would be going down very good. And we've also got a question from Robert Howard. Do you think the NFS should be re-established?
Right, well, I'm retired now, so I can say what I like without anyone withdrawing my pension. I firmly believe, and I'm sorry, I will have some officers reaching for their crucifixes at this point. I firmly believe that when the NFS was formed in 1941, it catapulted the fire service forward by 100 years. I think when it was returned to local authority control in 1948, it was set back 50 years. My own personal view is that the NFS should never have been disbanded. It was so successful, it worked so well, it could have been adapted for peacetime and should have been. And I still think that it would be a better governance model for the fire service in this country than the patchwork quilt of different governance arrangements and local jealousies, shall we say, that we've had to endure since 1948. That's just my view.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Bruce, for your point of view. I've got another statement from Peter and Claire Mancy. Excellent use of photos with a little script. A refreshing and professional presentation. Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
From Graham Maltby. Dear Bruce, your presentation was superb and maybe there will be an encore in the autumn. Down at the doctor's, I suppose. Yes.
If necessary.
And I've got another hand up for Andrew Morgan.
Yeah.
Have you got another question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, following up on what you just said, Bruce, as you say, probably people are reaching for their crucifixes or whatever. Who paid for the NFS? Given what you've just said about it, would have been a step forward. Was it for this operation? Was it the MOD or War Department as it was then, or was it the Home Office?
No, this was the Home Office. The NFS came under the Home Office. I don't honestly know whether the American forces made any contribution to the column that supported them in Europe. That'd be an interesting one to find out. I don't know the answer, but I'll see if I can find out. But no, the colour scheme was part of the NFS's contribution to the war effort, and consequently was funded, I won't say wholly by the Home Office, because it wasn't, because the crews that were billeted in support of military units were effectively taken onto their strength, and part of their activity was funded by the military. So, but mainly it was a Home Office responsibility.
Do you think the Army's ability to fight fires has increased since this time?
I think the Army Fire Service now isn't necessarily, in terms of numbers and capability, what it might have been in the past. It's been scaled back, along with the size of our armed forces. Their capability is undoubted. The Defence Fire Service is an extremely professional organisation, and their firefighters are as professional as any within the British Fire Service. But in terms of overall capability, I guess in line with the reduction in our armed forces, probably their capability has been reduced in parallel.
I think you're probably right. Many thanks indeed, Bruce.
Thank you, Andrew.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Right, we've got another comment from Alan Wells. Well done, Bruce. A fascinating aspect of D-Day. And another one from Lee Harvey. Super presentation, Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, I've got a hand up here for Graham Maltby.
Yep.
I can allow to talk, Graham. Okay, Graham, you're on. That's it.
Bruce, as Operation Colour Scheme came into its fruition in the South, and communities in those days were always on high alert, how did they manage to keep it under so much wraps, bearing in mind that these firefighters would have been, or firemen in those days would have, and firewomen would have been allowed off camp locally at some time? And have you got any idea how that interacted with the local crews from the NFS? Because surely they must have been quite bemused and with one eye shut, one eye open as to what was going on. Were they briefed confidentially, or were they just kept completely separate?
Bearing in mind that by this stage, the NFS had been in existence for 3 years, and they were extremely well integrated as a service. So they would have known for sure everything about it. I mean, everybody knew that an invasion was going to take place. You couldn't hide that, and although the coastal areas were in parts evacuated for security purposes, you couldn't disguise the fact that tens of thousands of troops were being gathered together in southern England, and everyone knew that the invasion was coming. Everyone knew it had to be protected. It was more the specific arrangements and locations of the scheme that had to be kept secret. You couldn't possibly keep it secret from the neighbouring crews, because they were part of the protection infrastructure themselves, and they would have been called to deal with incidents in the camps. And much like our old 11D visits, they probably would have gone and familiarised themselves with the assets. So if they were called to provide fire protection, you know, they'd know where to go and what to deal with.
Thanks, Bruce. It's quite interesting, actually, that the DFRMO, as they're called, the Defence Fire and Rescue Management Organisation, is now mainly run by Serco on contract. So Bruce is right. There's obviously a contract agreed between what the resource requirement is and what can be provided. So a lot of it is now, unfortunately, not integrated into the services itself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Graham. We've got a comment here from Anne Isaac saying, no high esteem for the brigade was such a shame. They asked for 10 items to only get 1 to simplify the stats previously given. And they still delivered and over-delivered. Massive respect should be given, without a doubt.
Thank you.
Also a comment from Tony Druitt. Thank you, Bruce. Fantastic presentation. So pleased to have seen it, Tony.
Thank you, Tony.
So I think we've got through all the questions so far. I've just got a closing comment, really. I didn't want to be caught on the hop on this presentation, Bruce. So I was looking around to see what I could find. And you probably know this anyway. But there is a forum on the War Relics website for Operation Colour Scheme, and it's got loads of photographs on there and comments from other people, and without a doubt, they're all saying, "I didn't know about this, and I didn't know about that." So what I'll do is, if you don't know the War Relics forum, I'll send out the email giving you that link so you can have a look at that as well.
Thank you, Colin.
Okay. I think I've got, is it Graham? You want to speak again?
I just want to, on behalf of the company as the master, thank Bruce for what's been an absolutely superb, interesting presentation that's generated a lot of interest. And I'm sure everybody on tonight will join me in thanking Bruce for the effort he's put into it. It's one of a number that we've been able to produce as a company during the lockdown period. And we are going to continue them online during the autumn. And I'm sure we'll be able to twist Bruce's arm for the sequel to the presentation he's given tonight. And I can only say on behalf of us all again, Bruce, our grateful thanks for what's been a superb evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Master. Thank you.
Thank you. Bruce, there is one that I missed off the bottom of the screen. I think it's from Lee Harvey. Where he said a super presentation, Bruce, thank you. He also goes on to say, Bruce, I believe we had a setback with the startup of the new museum in London. When it happens, fingers crossed it will, it would be an interesting element to show some of this in there, especially the pictures. I think we all agree on that.
I think one of the areas that we hope will be involved with in the new museum when it finally gets off the ground is an area that will feature particular aspects of the fire services activity over the years, and this would lend itself perfectly to one of those particular special events where we might feature this for educational purposes for a period of a few months in a special area of the museum. So I would really hope that might happen.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again, Bruce, for giving up your time to give us the presentation, and thank you to everybody else for giving up your time to come and listen to Bruce. The video should be up on our website, on our YouTube channel in the next 24 hours. And I'll send you all a link to the channel so that you can subscribe to that and see the rest of the presentations we've got. So thank you again, stay safe, and see you on the next presentation.
Thank you, Colin.
Goodbye.
Good night.
Goodbye. Bye.